It's a real pleasure to have a conversation with Professor Henry Bernstein, one of the founding figures of the field of agrarian change, and before that, peasant studies. I've been a colleague of Henry's for a long time, since my time here at SOAS. But as it turns out, I've also read his work in my days as an undergraduate student in India and also as a postgraduate student in the US. So it's a kind of an interesting moment for me, both to speak to someone whose work has been so influential in the field and also to a person who has been a colleague and a mentor and a friend for quite a while. Welcome, Henry, to this interview. One of the first things that people like us who grew up in India and studied, political economy or history, read, in which we came across your work, was the Journal of Peasant Studies. Just wanted to know a little bit from you the circumstances surrounding the founding of that journal. Why did you think that it was a good idea to have a journal? I know you are not one of the founding editors, but have been associated with that for a very long time. What was the need at that point to have a separate journal called the Journal of Peasant Studies?
Probably it could be answered better by Terry Byers, as you know, because he really was the moving spirit behind the founding of the Journal of Peasant Studies, and indeed for its first 12 or 13 years until I joined him as co-editor. One has to look back to that conjuncture, the 60s and 70s, and there were various dynamics at work, I think. One was the experience of China under Mao, and then also, of course, the Vietnamese liberation struggle, which was still taking place at the time the journal was founded. So the role of peasants in the history and politics of the modern world. This had already been initiated as a serious topic, of course, by Barrington Moore in 1966 in his book Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, which was one of three books Terry mentioned as part of the context of founding the journal, and all of those were published in '66 together with Barrington Moore. There was Eric Wolf's very little book on peasants, but the best little book of its kind I've ever read, and that was followed 3 years later in '69 by Wolf's Peasant Wars of the 20th Century, which was stimulated, as he said, by the Vietnam War and wanting to understand the place of peasant movements, peasant politics in forging of 20th century history. And the third book was the translation, the first full English translation of Chayanov's Theory of Peasant Economy. And the journal represented an interesting coming together, not without its tensions, between Terry and Theodore Shanin, who were the co-founders together with Charles Kerwin, who taught Chinese history at SOAS. Terry had come to the agrarian question through his interest in the development of India, and was frustrated by the lack of serious consideration of agrarian issues in the development economics literature. So he came from that direction. Shanin came from the direction of Chayanov. Shanin's first monograph, The Awkward Class on Russia, was published in '72, I think, the year before the journal was founded. And Shanin has told me a very interesting story, which I hope he writes up, that he didn't know about Chayanov before his first visit to the Soviet Union. And then he discovered all this material by Chayanov. And Theodore had a somewhat different ambition, if you like, which was to establish peasant studies inspired by Chayanov as an academic field in its own right, and which deserved to be an academic field in its own right. Shanin actually used the term which he invented, peasantology, to make that clear, peasant studies. And just before the journal started, there was this quite astonishing peasant seminar of the University of London, which again Terry had initiated. And for those who want to know more about the particular moment and the factors that led to the founding of the journal, they should read Terry's introduction to the 20-volume bibliography of the journal, which was published separately, and his wonderful essay on the history of the Peasant Seminar, which was in the first volume of the Journal of Agrarian Change, I think. It was a very, very refreshing moment. There were many people interested in questions to do with the peasantry, both historically and contemporary, and who attended the Peasant Seminar, like Eric Hobsbawm, many others. So I think that, and also it was a moment, as you will know, not necessarily at first hand, but from your extensive reading, of tremendous interest and growth and diversification, I would say, of interest in Marxism. When I look back at that moment, I realized, I'm reminded how much European Marxist work was being translated into English, much of it by New Left Books, now Verso, through the medium of New Left Review. So from Italian, the works of Gramsci, from German, and from French, and so on. So it was a moment of extraordinary intellectual and political vitality of Marxist approaches and debates.
And of course, that is how those of us who were studying in India got to learn about the Journal of Peasant Studies and to read that, because obviously so many scholars from India were coming to London or to Oxford and Cambridge for their further degrees, and then came back to teach people like us at Delhi University or at JNU or at Calcutta. So the seminar itself in London had this effect of disseminating or cross-pollinating perhaps, different readings. In our case, of course, not just Mao, but Gramsci became very key figures in the peasant studies literature coming out of India in the 1970s. And looking back at the volumes of the Journal of Peasant Studies, I can see that many of our academics and scholars published and thought of the JPS as a place in which they would like to see their work come out.
Indeed. I think India was very important, because I think India was the country in the South where there were the most informed and invigorating and challenging debates about peasantry in capitalism or backward capitalism, however you want to put it. And of course, Terry was, I used to call him a kind of overseas corresponding member of this tremendous constellation of agrarian political economists in India. And you're quite right, many of them did publish in the Journal of Peasant Studies, and I think the Indian debates were the most important, the most accessible, at least in English, that were available at the time.